Hi, this is Lily Vogelsang, the product manager of professional products here at Toon, and we're starting up a new video tutorial series here, which is our tip of the week series. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some of the issues that come up on the forums or issues that are emailed into support, and I'll give some little tips and tricks on how to resolve those issues and why we do things the way that we do. So this first tutorial that I'm going to talk about here is about pivot points, and I had talked about this a little bit with some people on the forums just before the holidays, and so I wanted to reiterate some of the things that I had said and use a better example here to show off why we do pivot points the way that we do. So I've just downloaded some sample material here from the Karate Rabbit that is available off of our website for download so that you can create your own rig using this sample material to help you to learn in the learning process. And so it's pretty much unrigged right now. We've just got all these drawing layers that are laid out here. All the artwork is done, but there's no pivot point set up and there's no hierarchy set up. And so one of the things that I want to point out here is that there's multiple ways of doing pivots, and there's multiple layers of pivots, meaning there is the ability to use your pivot tool here to set a pivot point, and when you set that pivot point, it sets it on the drawing layer. So for example, if you go into your drawing view and you isolate that drawing layer on its own, here I'm looking at the upper arm, then you'll see where that pivot belongs on that drawing layer. And now the reason that this is particularly useful is that sometimes you have a case like, let's take the hand here, where I've got several different hands, and right now they're all using the same pivot point because they're all overlapping, but as soon as I want to swap to a different view, so if I look at my camera view, here I am changing from the front to the side or the 3/4 view here, and you'll notice that the position of the hand changes. And if we set up the pivot point in the right spot here, then when you swap out that drawing, it's going to put the hand in the right spot. So that's the reason for this drawing level pivot. So basically the only reason or the only time that it's necessary to use a pivot on the drawing layer itself is when you want to have multiple views on the same timeline. Now sometimes what people do as an alternative is they will just separate the different views onto their own sort of hierarchies. So for example, they'll create one character template for the front and they'll have a completely separate character template for the side. And if you do it that way, then you don't need to use drawing level pivots. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So I'll just take this example here where I've got my hand and I've got my arm and my forearm. And they haven't sort of fixed all of the joints on this one, but that's okay because that's not really the purpose of what I'm talking about today. But let's just do the easiest type of hierarchy. I'll drag and drop my forearm onto my arm, and then I'll drag and drop my hand onto my forearm. And I'm using Animate Pro here, but I'm trying to follow steps that you could do on Animate as well, as far as I can, so that those of you who are using Animate can follow this. And of course, naturally, you can always do this in Harmony as well. So now I've got a hierarchy for my hand, my forearm, and my arm. And we set up the pivot points on here just by taking our pivot tool and plopping that pivot point where we want it to be on that drawing layer. So what's nice about this is the ability to go back and just animate on your drawing right away. So if you're not doing any kind of squash and stretch, then this is nice because you've got a direct hierarchy. You can move the hand and the forearm together. You can move the upper arm, the lower arm, and the hand all together. But what happens if you want to squash and stretch just one part like this? You'll notice as I squash and stretch my forearm there, it's also squashing and stretching the hand. And that's because there's a direct parent-child relationship here. And so this is the reason that we sometimes get ourselves into a situation where we want to have the flexibility of being able to manipulate the forearm on its own, but we also want to be able to manipulate it and the hand together. And that's when we get ourselves into this peg situation. So I'm just going to undo the hierarchy that I did before. And I'll select those 3 drawing layers. and I can click on the Add Peg button to add pegs for those drawing layers. Now, they're all now outside of a hierarchy, but what I can do, and this is kind of an important thing here, is you can take the peg of the hand and you can attach it to the peg of the forearm. Not to the drawing of the forearm, but to the peg of the forearm. And so now what this does is, and I'll do the same thing on the arm there. I'll take the forearm peg and I'll drag and drop the forearm peg onto the arm peg. So now what I have is I have the ability to select the peg layers, and you'll notice when I select the peg layer it selects everything underneath it, like so. But I can select the drawing layers, and the drawing layers can be manipulated independently. So if I want to just now squash and stretch that forearm, I can squash and stretch the forearm on its own. Now there's a couple of things to be aware of. Of course, you'll notice as I did that, now my hand sort of pops out of where it belongs in Z depth. And if you're using Animate Pro or Harmony, then you can use your network here to modify the Z depth of those different elements by changing their compositing order in your composite. So if I look at the hand, the arm, and the forearm, right now it looks like the hand is actually behind the forearm because, you know, they look that way over there. But if I look in my pipes over here, I can just plop that backwards in the pipe order, and now it looks fine in this view. But if you're not working in Animate Pro and you run into this situation where this is like this, then you can select that drawing layer and turn off your Animate button because you don't want to create a keyframe, and then you can actually just nudge it using, make sure that the focus, by the way, this red outline is around your camera view so that you can nudge properly. And sometimes I just hit the space bar and then click to get the focus in this view. You can also turn on a property called Focus on Mouse Enter, which will make it follow, the focus follow wherever your mouse head is. But I prefer not to work that way, so I like to just hit the space bar and then click to get it over here. And then I can nudge by using my Alt and up arrow to nudge backwards and Alt and down arrow to nudge forwards. So you'd have to rearrange those layers there, but for the moment I'll just do it this way since that's the easiest thing. Okay, so now that I've got these layers ordered properly, I might want to start animating here using those peg layers. And one also neat little trick to be aware of is that if you have selected a layer and you want to go up to its parent layer, then you can hit B, and B will take it up to the parent, and then B again will take it up to the next peg parent, and B again will take it up to the next peg parent. So it's really easy to go up the hierarchy. Shift B will take you back down again. So that's a pretty good thing to be able to know about, to make it a lot faster to animate. But you'll notice now, and I'll just turn back on my Animate button so that I see that being as yellow, I know that I'm able to animate this. So as I'll go up that hierarchy, you'll notice though that my pivot point here is always staying in the center of my camera view. And why is that? And the reason that that is because peg layers, now that I've added these peg layers to my drawings, peg layers have their own pivot point. So you know, you can either choose to use a peg layer's pivot point, or you can take the pivots that you've already set on your drawing layers here and you can promote them to the peg. So let me show you both of those. The first one that I mentioned was being able to edit the position of the pivot point on the peg layer itself. So let's try that with our hand peg layer here. I can select that peg layer, and if I want to change the position now of that rotate, I can use my rotate tool to change the position of the pivot. So now if I select the rotate tool, I see the pivot in the center here. I can drag that, and that changes the position of the pivot of my peg layer. But you'll notice that it changes the pivot for the peg layer for the entire timeline. So it's nice to be able to do that if you're not working with multiple views in one timeline, because if you're working with multiple views, then when you switch, for example, here from the front view to the 3/4 view, your peg pivot is not doing the trick. So long as all of the drawings here are overlapping, like let's pretend I'm just working on the 3/4 view here. It works really well. And that's what some studios do. Some studios just do one view at a time. They have a separated hierarchy for each view, and so they can simply use their peg layer pivot on its own without even touching the drawing layer pivots. But let's say that you do want to do multiple views in one timeline. Then this peg layer pivot is not going to work for you. It's not going to do what you need it to do. So the other option is you can take, and this is really pretty much an Animate Pro only option, Animate Pro and Harmony. You have the option of, if you look at the layer properties, I can double click on here to open up my layer properties window, or I can click on the yellow options box on my drawing layer there, or I can, oh, and it, sorry, popped up on my other screen here, so let me drag it over. And so once I see my layer properties, then in the drawing tab, this is the middle tab there, drawing, there is the option for embedded pivots. And right now it's set to apply embedded pivot on drawing layer. So basically what that means is when you're editing that pivot that you edit on the drawing layer with the drawing tool, then it's being used on the drawing layer, which makes sense. But what I want to do is I want to take this pivot that I've set on my drawing layer and I want to apply it instead to the parent peg. So if I select the parent peg option and now I go back and select my hand peg again, you'll notice that the peg is taking the pivot now from the drawing, which is really quite handy to be able to do because now I can have the different views all on one timeline. And so there's no right or wrong here when it comes to pivot points. It's really up to your own style of working, your own personal preference. The one thing to be aware of is that this apply embedded pivot on parent peg option does not exist in Animate. It's an Animate Pro and Harmony only option. So if you're working in Animate and you want to have that flexibility of being able to have this same style of rig where you can modify one drawing layer, but you can also modify the hierarchy there, then you can achieve that in a way that a clever way that they came up with in the video tutorial series that Shabana did on the website, where she outlines how to use a drawing layer instead of a peg layer here, which works okay as well. But this is the way that we recommend doing things. If you're using Animate Pro or if you're using Harmony, then you should use a peg layer and a drawing layer. And then you can either use the peg layer pivot directly by setting it with your rotate tool, or you can use your drawing layer and then promote the pivot to the peg, to the parent peg. Last thing I just want to mention here is that if you do something like if you promote the parent level peg there up to your pivot on your parent peg, but you have a separate pivot that's already been set on your peg layer, then everything will be offset because one pivot will be added to another pivot. So basically when you're editing the pivot point on your peg layer, let me open up the layer properties of my peg, and it's not wanting to open, so let me try again. Sometimes double clicking is a bit tricky with this tablet. Okay, so let's do it from here. Let's take my peg layer, which for some reason is all the way over here, and I'll open up the layer properties of that from there. Alright, so now I can see my layer properties of my peg layer, and here I still have the layer properties of my drawing layer. And you'll notice that in the layer properties of my peg layer, when you edit the pivot, what it's doing is it's editing the pivot value down here. And you'll notice that this is not something that can have a function in it over time. It's just something that's defined for the entire timeline. So if you ever get yourself into a situation where things are being offset like this and you don't understand why, then you can go back and put it down to 0, 0, and then now it should all be back where it belongs. So one last thing I just want to mention here on the subject of pivot points before we leave is you might want to know, why is it that we can't change the position of the pivot on the peg layer. And the reason that we didn't do that is because what a peg layer is a peg layer is just a layer that that contains information about translation, rotation, and scale, and it populates that information down to the children that are attached to it. And what often happens is that you will have more than one drawing layer that are all being controlled by the same peg. So, for example, when you're doing the head, when you're doing a rig on your head, you're probably going to have one rig for the facial features. So there'll be one peg layer that will have connected to it the nose, the eyes, the eyebrows there, and the mouth. And then you'll be able to move all of those drawing layers by moving your peg. But how does the peg know which one of those drawing layers it should use in order to determine its pivot? And that is defined when you're doing this use embedded pivots. So that's the reason that we can't just animate the peg layer over time, because you can't swap a peg layer. Like you can swap a drawing on a drawing layer, but there's no way of swapping a value on a peg layer because it's just a layer that contains that translation, rotation, and scale information. So that's the reason why if you want to have the position of a pivot animating over time, it needs to be connected somehow to a drawing layer. So hopefully that all makes sense, and we'll see you next week.